From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Psych, Health and Safety Canada. I'm Kim MacDonald, and I'm your host. And today I'm excited to introduce Andrea MacNevin, who is our guest today. And welcome, Andrea. Glad you could be here.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm very excited to hear about your area and your sort of all the things that you and I have talked a lot about psychological health and safety and your work over a few years. So my first question is to get you to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your experience, your journey, and the work you do.
Sure. So I actually trained as a mediator and was doing restorative justice facilitation before I decided to get a law degree. And I built a lot of alternative dispute resolution components into my law degree wherever I could by taking courses or doing moots that had ADR components, and being part of a law student society that had that was for ADR and restorative justice, actually. And then my first job after articling was with a boutique labor relations firm, and they did labor relations for special construction projects all across Canada. And I ended up doing a lot of work as a grievance manager for an employers association at one of these special construction projects, which resulted in writing a lot of statement of facts, a lot of gathering documentation from employers, and writing statement of facts from the perspective of not trying to advocate for the employer, but just say what happened here, because the employers association sort of advises the employer on how to follow the collective agreement, and is not totally impartial, but it did help me. That exercise, I mean, in that case, there were, in the end, over 400 grievances filed. So I probably wrote hundreds of statements of facts. And that exercise was really helpful for me in developing skills around writing investigation reports. And the other thing that happened in that role was there was a respectful workplace review committee for the Employers Association. And so they would review all of the respectful workplace complaints that came in from various employers. And so we would look at how an employer was managing the complaint and advise them on whether or not they were following the policy correctly. And in that way, I got really used to and comfortable with respectful workplace policy. And I also got to see the investigation reports that were written by third parties. So that was also really helpful. It's really helpful if you're able to, when you're trying to learn to become an investigator, to see other people's work. I'm always really excited to see other people's it sounds really nerdy, but it's true. It's really great. It's really great to see how people put things together and how they lay things out. And I think so those two components of that work were really helpful for me in becoming an investigator. I did my first investigation in 2019, and that was before I'd done any formal investigation training. I had only had the experience that I had, and I also read the textbook by Reuben Tomlinson on workplace investigations, and which I've actually misplaced this copy. I don't know where my copy is. And it is something I turn to quite often. And recently I went to look something up, and I don't know what I've done with it. So
for our listeners, they need to find a copy of that as well.
It's a really good book. Yeah. I think it's really well written, and it's helped me out a lot. There might even be a newer edition, and there are other great texts on workplace investigation. That's just the one that I went to, and I would recommend it. But then probably, during the pandemic, I had already done a couple or a few investigations at that point. Well, sorry, quite a few, because I did act as the equity officer with Acadia University for a period. And in that role, I was actually receiving complaints and investigating and, or informally resolving complaints. So yeah, when I finally did training to get a certificate in investigation, I'd already been doing it quite a bit. And I did my certificate through what are they called? Aptus Training Solutions. And it's a lawyer out of Ontario that operates that practice. And I found it.
So the training's interesting for workplace investigators. So it's offered by different organizations, Andrea?
Yeah, you can. And I'm not that knowledgeable about, what is the best or top-notch investigation training to get yourself. The Aptus training was good. I had done, I don't even know how I found out about them, but I did. They had also offered a alternative, like a training on alternatives to workplace investigation. So, the premise for that training was held in Newfoundland. And the premise for that training was sometimes people ask for workplace investigations to be done. And as an investigator with alternative dispute resolution training, you can see the dispute that you're asked to investigate and also see that potentially this could be resolved without an investigation being required, which is this sort of, it's kind of like the med-arb debate, which I don't know.
So mediation,
within alternative dispute resolution, there's sort of sometimes usually under collective agreement, they would appoint an arbitrator to hear a dispute. And sometimes arbitrators are also trained as mediators. And I've seen this done where an arbitrator can get permission from the parties to try and mediate the dispute first. And if they can't reach a mediated resolution, then they'll return to arbitration. The dispute is around, does that arbitrator conflict themselves out of arbitrating if they've mediated? Okay. Anyway, same question with investigators. Are you conflicting yourself out of investigating a dispute if you've tried to mediate it first? And, it's very possible. It's highly, highly likely. But this training anyway looked at getting the consent of the workplace who'd hired you as a third party, and then getting the consent of the parties to do this sort of facilitated discussion type of alternative dispute resolution, that rather than doing an investigation, because investigations tend to embed conflict into the workplace. So just to back up a little bit, so what are some of the options, when an employer and there is some conflict within, so I guess maybe just backing it up a little bit for us, which is, there's options like mediation, like a workplace investigation, a formal workplace investigation. Are there other options within that too, kind of along that same vein? Yeah, within mediation, there's all kinds of forms of mediation. And I think it really depends on the workplace, like the size of the workplace, the type of work that's done in the workplace, the sophistication of the workplace. All of these things matter, because like a very small employer probably doesn't even have a policy, but might have the ability to more naturally, informally resolve a dispute with two employees. If the employer happens to have, you wouldn't even need mediation skills. You could just have communication skills and help two people work through a dispute. But normally, if there is a policy, then there'd be something that they would have to follow in terms of, whether something could be informally resolved or whether it needs to go to formal. And I guess it would really depend. Everything would depend on the policy and what it says and making sure that you're meeting those requirements.
So in that case, the workplace has an explicit policy on what are the options that you can follow for complaints within the workplace. How would that be typically described? Is it for complaint process, or is it interpersonal conflict, or how would they describe that typically in a policy?
There's so many policies out there that it could be anything, or it could be described many different ways, I should say. But normally it would define at the outset what types of disputes the policy is aiming to resolve. And so typically we would see this as harassment of some kind. So an anti-harassment policy of some sort. And these are all getting different names. They used to usually be called a respectful workplace policy for many years, but that's changed.
Okay.
And people are still using that. It's just that in certain circles, the term respect or respectful can mean so many different things, even culturally, that it becomes difficult to use that as a marker. If it can mean so many different things to different people, like sort of behave disrespectfully, that could be a matter of interpretation, and that may, in and of itself, be disputed. But the definition of harassment, which is conduct that was or ought to be known to be unwelcomed, is sort of a more clearer, but there's still lots of gray area.
And is that embedded in the policy, or is it formalized in legislation or law, I guess?
It's
that
both.
You're guided by
both. Like policies will often have their own definition of harassment, which is usually borrowed from like maybe legislation like a Human Rights Act or something like that. And the problem with Human Rights Acts is that harassment would have to be based on, like you'd have to say the harassment was based on a protected characteristic. Sorry, I have this little cold. But with, as Kim and I have discussed many times, in all provinces and territories in Canada, other than Nova Scotia, there is legislation that prescribes psychological health and safety in the workplace. In Nova Scotia, we don't have anything, but ordinarily you could look to a statute like occupational health and safety regulation or a workers' compensation regulation, where there would typically be a definition for harassment that you could rely on. So in Nova Scotia, you just couldn't, there's just nothing here in Nova Scotia. Obviously you could look to Ontario or
another jurisdiction,
Yukon or wherever. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that brings that intersection of the workplace investigation, the work that you do in psychological health and safety. So for many people, they may not see, and that's why I'm really interested in having you have this conversation, because it's around that the language of psychological health and safety is, there's more and more conversations about it. Obviously, we have a podcast, we have we have an international standard, we have a Canadian standard that's voluntary. And so we're having a lot more conversations around psychological safety, but the law and the legislation and or a policy within an organization, those variations sort of give different weight to different things. And the approach that from a workplace investigation, does that inform the investigation, or does the investigation have a particular sort of a process that is a standard process for a formal investigation?
So that depends, but it is in a lot of cases, like I've been asked to do, investigations where the policy needs so badly to be revised that it actually makes the investigation more cumbersome in trying to meet the policy requirements. But I've also seen scenarios where, policies are so well written that they really assist in navigating the investigation process. But you don't even need a policy. Like, an organization could not have a policy, and you could still investigate conduct that was alleged to be harassing. I've also had employers contact me about investigation work, and because they're a small organization, rather than coming in and conducting an investigation and, charging sending them a big bill for that work, I just coach them on how to do it themselves, because there's not a need all the time to have a third party do it. But if the employer has never been coached or educated on how to conduct an investigation, then that can feel like it's too outside of their role, but it really would be within the purview of what a owner or a manager can do, as long as they are given some guidance on how to do it. Really, it's only getting a third party is only required where it could be considered a conflict to have the organization do it themselves, or because it's so complex, they'd rather have somebody from the outside come in and do it. And in some cases, it's just known that there's no in-house training or expertise on that. So they just choose to get someone third party to come in and do
external. And yeah. So independent, external, third party. So are all those words strung together for that the role that's sort of an external party? But that is workplace investigation on the internal side. Does it usually fall, you're working with HR, or does it depend on, who, when a complaint is made or there is an issue, does it usually stem from a complaint, a specific complaint? And so that's the trigger for a workplace investigation?
Usually, yeah. Usually there's a complaint. I have had, and this does happen, where there's no complaint, but there's a situation like where a bystander witnessed something. So the organization becomes aware of conduct that could be harassing. Those are a bit more tricky. And I'm so sorry. The Reuben Tomlinson textbook actually has a great chapter on this, on how to navigate the request for an investigation in the absence of a complainant. Okay. And some policies also are created with that in mind, to say that the organization, universities are a good example. There's a number of universities in Nova Scotia who have sexual violence policies where the organization can act as the complainant to have conduct reviewed in the absence of the complainant coming forward, if there's a concern that is great enough that, and I think where it becomes difficult is you have to put the allegations to the respondent. And how do you do that if there's no complainant? But there's ways to do that. But it's difficult, that due process part. It's not always possible. The other, not really the same, but this is also with universities. They and sexual violence policies will often have a provision where the complainant doesn't need to be investigated, doesn't need to participate in the investigation. Once they've provided a disclosure and told their story, they can step back and allow the process to proceed with that statement. And that's provided that the statement has enough information in it to put the allegations to the respondent.
So they don't, so maybe for a typical, so that's for many universities or the universities you've experienced, what is usually the role for each of the parties in this, I guess, from an HR perspective, from the complainant or a bystander or a witness or a responding party. So maybe just to describe those parties a little bit, Andrea, in the process of an investigation of a potential harm that's been had within the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I use these terms so frequently that sometimes I forget that people might not know what a complainant is. So esoteric of me, but but complainant is the person who is making the complaint.
Is raising the issue.
Yeah.
And has
allegations of some kind of harm. And so they bring those forward usually through it, provided there's a policy, it's usually through some sort of formal complaint process under the policy. But if there's not a formal complaint process, someone ought to be able to bring allegations of harassment or psychological harm in the workplace forward to somebody within the organization. And then, ostensibly they would be referred to as the complainant. And then the respondent is the person who is having allegations made against them. So they're the person who is being asked to respond to the complaint. And then the investigator, their role is, they would be told, this is the complaint, this is the respondent, here's some background information. And then as they begin to navigate that issue, and maybe usually I would speak to the complainant first, if that's appropriate, to make sure I have the whole story and understand. And then I would speak to the respondent, and before I speak to the respondent, I would, or the complainant, I usually send a letter to say, I've been appointed as an investigator, and here's what you can expect in the process. And then sometimes when you're asked to do an investigation, it's already clear by the background that you're provided of who may have witnessed some of the alleged incidences. And sometimes it's not. And so after speaking with the main parties, you start to get an idea of who else you may need to talk to get, usually the complainant and the respondent have different versions of what happened. So then you need to speak to other witnesses about what happened or what they saw in order to try and get the full picture of this situation. Yeah.
What's human resources role in that process, or the manager, I guess, of the two parties that are involved in it?
Well, I'd say that depends from organization to organization. Like some organizations don't have a human resource department. And then, just recently I was working with a policy where the harassment policy has no prescribed role for HR, other than storing a copy of the complaint when it's finalized for 7 years. And that's their role. And then, there's other organizations where HR would have a role of maybe ensuring the policy is followed, contacting a third-party investigator, notifying the respondent that a complaint was filed, receiving complaints from a complainant, and having a much more active role in navigating the process for the organization. I
would think that the process itself can be difficult for parties in this process.
Yeah.
There is lots of discussion around trauma-informed investigations, and which I understand, but love to hear your thinking on it, which is a smaller piece. Maybe not every workplace investigator looks at it with a trauma-informed lens, but maybe share a little bit about that and because as an outsider to investigation, the investigation in and of itself would be difficult and stressful for all of the parties involved, I would say, even a witness would find it a struggle because you're working within a team inside an organization. So that human element is still there, even as this very clear process is happening.
It's a really fine line to walk. I think in general, being trauma informed is not an exact science. And I think it's a moving target. I think as an investigator, you have to, like, I can't be overly friendly with people, and you have to walk that line of being warm but neutral. But once you are trying to stay in neutral territory, neutral is very easily interpreted as cold. And so it can be difficult to have that, especially in the initial communications with people. And you're right, like contacting a witness, sometimes I just need to know, was the door open or closed? That's my only question for you. Was the door open or closed? That's all I need to ask them. But they just see investigation and lawyer in the same email. Like, it's so anxiety inducing for people. And I'm not really sure how to fix that part of it. Maybe I should put a big paragraph at the beginning. And I do say this, like, you're not being investigated. I just need that you have some relevant information, but people sometimes don't even see that part of the email. They just see investigator, lawyer, and then they're nervous and feel
their nervous system goes into
completely
engaged.
Yeah. And so anyway, sometimes that's easy to navigate with a little smoothing, but I think the more, I don't know if important is the right word, but in terms of trauma informed, a lot of times in these third parties I'm brought in as a third party because it's a sensitive, delicate, difficult topic, and something bad happened to somebody and they have to talk about it. And I think very generally trying to get people to tell me as much of the story as I need to hear without having them go into other details that I maybe don't need to hear. So trying to guide the information coming so that we don't go further into harm that can be further traumatizing or re-traumatizing. But also just taking breaks. I was thinking about this today before we talked. I was thinking
so the process itself, like just structured in a way,
because I think sometimes people try to be tough. So if I say, "Want to take a break?" I'll be like, "No, I'm good." But what I know is, having given disclosures to people about, things that have happened to me, or recently someone in my personal life was telling me something that happened to them, and she did a really good job of articulating something that I hadn't been able to really put words around before. But she told me this thing, and then she was like, I feel really weird now that I said that to you. Like, I feel really
saying it out loud,
exposed. And even though it's me, and even though she loves me and we trust each other, it's still like, it's just having it out there. And so I was like, good, we don't have to talk about it. Let's change this up. We'll talk about something else. But it made me think that I get so many disclosures from people. And I think, it maybe is a good trauma-informed practice to just go, not to say, well, rather than saying, you just said something, you just told me something really personal and difficult. Do you want to take a break? Rather than saying that, just say, I still have more questions to ask you, but I feel like we're in a good place to take 5. I'm going to go to the bathroom and get some water. You can do whatever.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
That is a very good observing practice. Yes, Andrea, that seems like a very intuitive observing practice of always learning. Yeah. Of always learning and knowing we can learn from other places, not only in our area of expertise in the work. Yeah. It's like having that observation, skill and capacity and letting it inform other places. Yeah. So you shaping when that happens versus giving, it's that navigating between agency that I can take a break and also helping to structure it because of your known understanding, having the experience with this, then this is a good place.
Yes, which might be difficult if it's like right at the beginning of the interview. You maybe need to think of something else, but that was just, normally it doesn't come out at that stage. Normally it's after you've been talking for a while and gotten to a point where someone is, because usually the investigation questions start with, what's your title? How long have you worked there? That kind of thing. Do you work with so-and-so? And just like working your way into the story. So normally things don't just...
So is that sort of the beginning, so it's almost a statement of data and information gathering?
Yeah.
At the beginning, which is a part of the process before you get into some of the conversation around what may or may not have happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
How can you build psychological safety within that? And I guess maybe you've answered that a little tiny bit, which is where I'm interested in that piece where you help someone understand that they don't have to tell you for the purposes of this piece, but I need to know this other piece for the purposes of this investigation. So it's kind of that helping someone stay safe for themselves, sort of more globally, but also certain information is required, certain information is not. And by virtue of you explaining to them where that line is or where we can talk around that line so that they can, that trauma informed, they can stay safe about that. And you may need to know about these other things though.
I think that's it. The sexual violence policies where they create that process where the complainant doesn't have to participate is a good example of how you could build that in, again, because you have the story, they've told somebody else and you now have a disclosure as in the form of a statement of what they say happened. And if, this is a total hypothetical. I'm imagining that this could happen based on it's never actually happened. But in that situation, I can imagine a scenario where you speak to the respondent and based on the respondent's answers, you now have follow-up questions that you want to ask the complainant. And therefore, in asking the complainant, you can say, I've received your statement. I don't need you to tell me this story again. I just need to ask you some really specific questions about what time on Thursday did you arrive at the location? And so that you could, you could build your questions so that you're just asking for this information and making it clear to them that you don't need to go there.
But it's interesting. As in the process, do you share, or I guess the organization share, to prepare each of the parties in that process so they know what to expect going through it? Is that the, I guess, the role of the letter that's sent? Does that communicate some of those pieces of it for both parties?
Yeah, but do people read the letter? I don't know.
Is that my ideal? Is that my ideal?
I think that's the purpose of the letter is that. But I think
to reduce anxiety perhaps for everyone in the process.
But I think people don't necessarily read the letter. I think, and then there's certain organizations, especially like unionized environments, shop stewards are great to help people to understand, for complainants and respondents to understand that this is an investigation. They'll always have a shop steward present with them through that process. And the shop steward's able to say, like, she's an investigator. Like, they are helpful in explaining what to expect for that process and allowing it to feel a little less, I guess, just taking people's anxiety down a few notches.
I think that would be helpful because we know that as humans, uncertainty and humans, it is something we're very uncomfortable with, uncertainty. So the more small ways that some of that can be managed still effectively and, with just very explicit, easy to understand, this is the process and this is the process of other things and this is what to expect. And when a report comes, you will have this. The organization has this, like those descriptions can help, I would think, for all the parties involved, make it a little more, it's going to be a difficult process anyway. These are humans going through a difficult, process at work, in a workplace, in a place that they're dependent on for their livelihood and taking care of all the needs of themselves and their families. So these are very serious processes, but it's like what all of that trauma-informed sort of conversation around what are the pieces and when and how do we continue to improve processes, whether it's a formal investigation or another, mediation, as you've referenced to. So does that, for mediation, does that also, the mediation conversations, the mediation work, does that also, you bring your trauma-informed lens to that as well?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. A mediation would be an example, I guess, would be, not bringing the parties into the same room. If you've spoken to both sides before the mediation and it's clear that, this is not going to go well. Like if I bring them into the same room, this is going to trigger this person in the following ways. And in order to, try and resolve the part of the dispute that we can resolve through mediation, it's better if I just go back and forth between them. And if, and that's not the same as restorative, but in restorative, usually the final thing that happens with restorative is that the parties come together and they communicate about what happened, but there's a lot of work leading up to that to prepare them by the facilitator over time, going back and forth between them and explaining what each one is saying. But the final thing was you would bring them together and allow that. Sometimes there be components of that conversation that are difficult, but it allows things to get said and some sort of resolution to happen naturally through that conversation, which isn't always successful. But in my experience, when restorative sessions are done well, there is usually some layer of healing that happens. Like it doesn't fix everything, but usually both people walk away feeling like I'm glad I did it. I didn't necessarily think I wanted to go into this, but at the outset, after it's over, they feel happy that they did, or slightly better that they did. If it's done well, if it's done properly.
Yeah. For the organization, what sort of, as there are parties involved in this, what is the organization's role, I guess, through this process, I guess, whether it comes down to if it's a restorative example or the mediated or the investigation, do they have different roles in that? Or is it's all coming through the workplace, obviously, and it's coming, but do they participate in any of those at all? Like would a manager be participating or the HR be participating in them? Or is it only the parties that are involved in those kinds of?
In mediation?
Yeah, let's start with mediation. Yeah.
I mean, it would depend on the dispute, who needs to be at the table. Like,
okay.
With workplace disputes between employees, I prefer to just be the employees that are involved to get to get them really talking without having a manager in the room or having HR in the room. Just inhibits their ability to feel comfortable saying what they really want to say. But sometimes I've done that, and then as a final stage, brought the manager in. If there's going to be some sort of written agreement about what their resolution is, you might need someone from the organization to say, like, yes, the organization can support all of these items that they've agreed to, or like, no, we couldn't do that, but we could do this. And so making it make sense and making it be something that people could actually follow.
So to that end, and around investigations, what is included in a report, and who gets the report at the end of this?
That also depends.
Okay.
It depends on the policy. And if the policy doesn't prescribe who the report goes to, then I would take instruction from the organization of who I'm giving it to at the end. And sometimes organizations want to see a draft before you send a final. And so they want to be able to, I don't know, maybe ask about something that they don't see in the report to say, I don't see any finding on this, or, can we redact some of this information, or I don't think that we want to share this, or I don't know, whatever they may, they may have no suggestions. They may just say, great, thank you, this is fine. And yeah, but sometimes it's really clear at the beginning that there's a policy, and the person that contacted me is who's going to get the report at the end, and they just give me everything and they walk away. And
now, for that investigation, does the complainant get a copy of the report and the responding party get a copy of the report?
Again, it depends. Like,
okay,
I think that's pretty rare. Usually,
okay.
I have seen that done where the parties get the copies of the report, but more often they get a summary of the information that came from the report that's relevant to them.
Okay.
And so a respondent and a complainant might get the same version. But if, say, the respondent had, if there was more than one complainant and one respondent, the respondent might get 3 different summaries, and each complainant would just get the one summary
that refers to their complaint.
Or vice versa. There could be
right
one complainant and multiple respondents, and same thing. Like, they just get the information from the report that's relevant to their part of the investigation. And yeah. And I guess, that's just like privacy stuff and employee file privacy issues. And normally
for
a complainant.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, normally a complainant, this can be problematic, doesn't know if, like, say there's a finding of harassment, which can feel, vindicating on some level, but then they don't know what's done, how the organization responds to that finding. And they would only know, for example, if they're clearly fired, then it would be obvious, but they wouldn't know if they were given a written warning. That would never be communicated to the complainant. And it's that this piece of investigation work that leaves people still feeling like it didn't bring any healing to the situation. It just came in and said the thing happened that I said happened. And, and now more people know, even though there's confidentiality requirements, my experiences, employees talk in workplaces, and you can try and mitigate that as much as possible, but you're never going to prevent it. And they just...
How can we support? I think, my interest is in supporting all of the parties, obviously, learning, growing, and creating, preventing future issues or future harms, enabling the organization. You don't look for these kinds of situations, but when they do come, that trying to figure out, if you're looking at psychological health and safety, you're looking at, assessing the situation, you're looking at prevention, you're looking at protection, putting protective factors in place, like learning and education is always a really good protective factor, in addition to some of the prevention things you might do. And then trying to support things as they go forward. So in all of those pieces of psychological health and safety, these investigations or a mediation or any kind of restorative, assignment, I guess, inside an organization has a lot of opportunity to change things for the better going forward. Because now what, you've had an answer to those findings. And then as the organization looks inside, how can they then take that information and go into further depth of sustaining, creating positive change, preventing things from, happening again? And what are some of the recommendations that you would have following an investigation, for example, to help prevent and protect employees going forward, and also creating space for, if the responding party is not, depending on, I guess, what the issues are, not fired or let go because of the issues, then they all have to live together inside this organization going forward. So I'm just wondering what organizations can do to work with the information they have that comes up in an investigation.
In a lot of cases, I don't make any recommendations. So I'm just asked to come in and report on what happened. So they want my findings of fact. So I investigate and I write a report that says, on a balance of probabilities, here's what happened. And it is or it isn't a breach of the following policy or policies. And then I give that to them to do what they are going to do with it. In some cases, I'm asked to make recommendations.
What are some examples of recommendations that they ask?
Well, to be honest, I don't like making recommendations. I'd prefer not to. It makes it difficult because because I'm also a labor and employment lawyer, so I'm familiar with, what type of behavior, would likely be just cause for termination. So I'm able to say, this is so egregious that my recommendation is that this person be terminated. I don't want to do that. I prefer that,
to give it to them, like it's their organization to figure it out. I've given you the information you need to go forward in whatever way is appropriate for your organization.
And if you want to, have your lawyer read it and get them to make a recommendation. But I think, on the flip side of what you're asking, which is I have in some cases made recommendations for how to try and make this better, like where it's clear that, there's been some wrongdoing, but what's really the problem is that this relationship needs repair. So I have made recommendations that the organization look into trying to have some kind of mediation or restorative session between two employees to try and resolve that. And in some cases, I've seen organizations do that, or they've reported back that they've done that. I mean, it's kind of piecemeal work because there's always going to be, especially in larger organizations, there's always going to be relationship issues in these types of workplaces. But, you know, there is like Ron Pizzo, and he has that, they do this putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so it's him and a psychologist. I just can't remember her name at the top of my head right now.
He doesn't know it yet, but I'll hopefully be chatting with him. So.
Oh, good. Yeah. So they do
Thanks,
this.
We'll throw him out there.
Yeah. So they do this.
It's another piece. It's sort of it's a part of a process. And so the investigation sort of has one component that can live in and of itself. And then other
and I think
pieces. Yeah.
Most organizations approach it as investigation, findings, and then discipline or no discipline, and then back to work. But what Ron's work and what I think really makes sense is it's kind of that now what thing, because it is, you can't just go back to work. There needs to be something else that makes this. And people do when people are asked to, and they're expected to, but it's not excellent. It's really not.
No. And so there is bigger, all of these things come up because of the psychosocial factors there are risk factors, there's harms, there's hazards within that. So the work of figuring out, that's where workplace assessments that we do come in, which is not it is not a workplace investigation, that it is a complaint, but doing some of this other work, which is around, it's a long journey. It's a journey of different pieces of the puzzle. So I think it's interesting, so that it's sort of that investigation, the findings of fact that you've articulated, and then the organization figuring out in its own strategic interests what makes sense to them. Based on their own resources. What advice would you give to organizations on what are some of the, probably in your experience, different skills and competencies for employees or for managers inside the organization that could help support better outcomes, I guess, and help support some of those hazards and harms that we see? What are some of the skills and competencies? I think the number one is just don't avoid information when you receive it. So as soon as you become aware of an issue or a potential issue, then address it head on, and don't wait for it to grow into something bigger and worse. Don't pretend it's not happening, because that is when you're going to need to bring somebody else in. That's when it's going to grow into something you really don't want to have to deal with. Then you'll feel like you don't want to deal with the small thing, but the small thing can be dealt with very easily, and it can avoid you a lot of other problems and issues down the road. And I think, and that can be, like I said earlier, just this could all be, especially in smaller organizations, dealt with through communication and head on, dealing with things head on. Not everything, like some things need to be investigated for sure. And there's certain times that's just what's needed, but sometimes it would benefit everybody if the people who are in positions of leadership just take that information and begin to work through it as soon as they receive it. Because things get messy quickly, easily. Yeah. Well, that is good final advice for people. It's observing sooner and taking taking the information and acting sooner. That is good prevention. However, obviously, when it reaches certain characteristics, then the investigation is the right solution as well.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation around workplace investigation, that intersection of that investigation with psychological health and safety. And I appreciate all that you've shared and all that our listeners have probably learned about workplace investigation that they may not have known before, because it's a lot more complicated than, and I think for many people, I believe this to be true because it certainly is one for me before I started doing some of this adjacent work, which is you don't know all of these things. You don't know these processes that are happening or even are available inside an organization in many cases. And because of the nature of them, they happen with the parties involved. And then the organization has the report, and then the organization's going to do something, and you may or may never know. Obviously, you're not involved in that, so you wouldn't hear about that information. So I think it helps to shed some light on these other processes that organizations can take to help improve the situation, or at least as early as they can create sort of a hard stop on something and try to put a process in place so that harms are reduced. And then once they have the report to do with it, whatever makes sense for them and their organization. So I appreciate you sharing with that.
My pleasure.
So yeah, that's it for today. And I want to thank all of our listeners. And if they were to get in contact with you, Andrea, how can they reach out to you?
I can be reached at my Bartow Lawyers address. So it's A MacNevin, MacNevin at bartowlawyers.com. And Bartow is Barteaux.
Excellent.
Okay.
And for myself, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or at 13 Factors. And if you're here listening to this podcast, hopefully you can jump into some of the other ones and learn some other amazing things about psychological health and safety in Canada. And thanks, Andrea, for joining us today. And until next time, we'll talk to you then. Okay.
It's always great
Thanks
to talk to you. Thanks, Kim.
See ya.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.